Great to have you back for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. Since the onslaught of the pandemic, there has been a debate over the nature of paid sick leave in this country and its cost and extent. Should it be available to everyone? Should it be temporary or permanent? And who pays? Our returning guest is Shawn Taylor. He is the senior features editor of C2C Journal. He has written the article, Paid Sick Days, How Not to Spur an Economic Recovery. Peter, thanks for joining us again.
It's a pleasure to be back, Tony.
So what about your main point? Why are paid sick days a bad idea?
We start with the end of the story rather than the beginning. Paid sick days are not a bad idea as a general concept, I would say. I think it makes sense that you want workers to stay at home, especially during a pandemic. If paying them is the way you get that done, then certainly we should be considering some sort of paid sick days during a once-in-a-century pandemic. So at first blush, there's some things to like about the concept. I think the real problem comes when, as you said, who pays for it? Given that this is a generational event, the COVID pandemic, I think it makes sense that we would want a temporary solution to solve our temporary problem, and in which case that seems to call for some sort of government program. The problem that I argue arising from paid sick days is that you have a constituency out there who want the paid sick days to be paid for by employers. They want this to be a permanent feature of the labor market. They have a kind of European style workplace in mind, and this is their opportunity to squeeze in a policy that they, labor, I'm talking about labor and the NDP, et cetera, to promote a policy that they've been advocating for quite a long time, decades even. So it's a kind of an opportunistic approach, trying to turn it into a permanent employer-paid sick day program.
So walk us through, if it was to be or is to be employer-paid, how is that harmful for our economic recovery?
Well, it's going to put a brand new burden on businesses, especially small businesses, at the most vulnerable time. We've seen all sorts of, I'm not telling you anything you don't know here. It's been a very difficult time for all businesses and small businesses in particular. The CFIB, Canadian Federation of Independent Business, their survey, they suggest 1 in every 6 businesses in the country may be at risk of shutting down permanently because of the lockdowns and dislocations and all the problems that have been arisen from the lockdown. So as we hope to see a recovery in the next coming months, we want businesses to be able to hire. We want them to be able to get back to doing what they used to do. We want them to be trying to expand and adding a new, essentially a new payroll cost onto them right from the get-go. It just seems silly. It's working exactly against what you want. If we want a robust recovery, we don't want to put new burdens on businesses right now.
So could you walk us through the history of the COVID response in this country and why paid sick days became such an issue?
Sure. Paid sick days, we started hearing about it quite early on in the pandemic. There were some federal provincial meetings, I think in the spring, late spring, early summer. The feds and the provinces got together and they said, we need to do something here. There was I forget the proper title of it, some sort of recovery agreement between the feds and the provinces. And Ottawa talked about some kind of program that morphed into Jagmeet Singh's demand that there had to be 10 days of paid sick day in the throne speech, or he wasn't going to support the minority Liberal government. And so we have now the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit that does offer 10 days of 10 paid sick days for anyone in the country that needs it. It's a temporary program. It ends this September. It is taxpayer funded. It's an Ottawa funds it, the $1.1 billion they put into it. So we do have a temporary program. A lot of people complain about it. They don't think it's generous enough or it's too complicated, but you can tweak that
Right.
if there's problems. But we do have
Sure.
a program right now.
Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum. Our guest is Shawn Taylor, talking about paid sick leave as an economic issue as much as a political issue. Peter, you did reference before the break the costs associated with the program. Could you unpack that a little bit more for our audience?
Well, the current program we have that the federal government runs, they've allocated $1.1 billion for that. I think they've spent $350 million so far, so I guess that's on track. So that's what a current temporary program would cost. If we switch to a permanent employer-paid program, then obviously the taxpayers aren't funding it. What's that going to cost? Well, it depends how long the sick day is, obviously. You can imagine something like 10 days is going to cost right off the bat 4% of a company's payroll cost if you assume 251 working days in the year. But then when you get into, well, does the employer hire someone to cover for those sick days? Then you could easily double that. You can, if you just do the math on that, it could be up to 8% of a payroll cost. So it's huge as we're just hoping to have a recovery. So those are the costs there. Some people say that it should be maybe run by employment insurance. Then you would see some sort of 60-40 split perhaps between employers and employees. I don't know. That could be negotiated as you go forward.
One of the aspects of this that I noticed was there seemed to be a little bit of political ping pong going on between the federal government and the provincial governments, that whenever Premier Ford, as an example of Ontario, was asked about this issue, he says, no, that's the federal government, it's not us. But there is pressure on Premier Ford on this too. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Well, I think Ford deserves some credit for standing up and saying, no, we've got a temporary taxpayer-funded program. Some people complain it's not generous enough. They just recently expanded it from 2 weeks to 4 weeks. So there's obviously room to improve the federal program. But how often people on shows like this complain about duplication between the federal and provincial governments? One hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing. We have the federal government doing something everyone says is necessary. Why would we want the province to do the same thing? So I think Ford is on pretty solid ground. He certainly takes a lot of criticism for people that want a permanent employer-paid program, but he's standing his ground, and I think it's a legitimate stance to take.
Has it become a federal provincial issue elsewhere other than Ontario? Do you know?
Well, Ford is in an unusual situation because he canceled 2 days of paid personal leave when he became premier. So there's this idea that Ontario had it and now they've lost it and he should bring it back again. But you hear out in certainly paid sick day, you hear about it all across the country. In general, the provinces want the feds to make their program more attractive. I haven't seen any provinces say we're leaping into a new permanent employer-paid program that of the sort that the Labor and some opposition politicians seem to want. So the provinces don't want to get themselves into anything permanent right now. So they, as you say, they complain Ottawa doesn't do enough, but that's pretty standard. So
the idea of, quote, stay home if you're sick, you're not objecting to that per se.
No,
but you're just saying,
could you?
Yeah, but you're saying that it's a flawed.
If you're sick, go to work.
Yeah, no, of course,
I'm not saying that.
Yeah, but if you're saying that it's a flawed approach the way it's being handled right now, is that right?
Well, I think the general notion of a temporary taxpayer-funded program makes sense. So the concept of what Ottawa is doing is fine, and that's the essence of what Ford is saying. He's saying the feds are doing it, I don't have to. Lots of critics don't like how the federal program works, so maybe it needs to be tweaked a bit. As I said, they've already increased it from 2 weeks to 4 weeks of coverage, so that suggests there's room for improvement. But I think that's where we need to focus our efforts.
We will continue with this interesting topic after the break. Please stay with us as we continue our discussion with Peter Shawn Taylor, the Senior Features Editor of C2C Journal. Stay with us. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. It's Tony Clement here with Peter Shawn Taylor. He is the Senior Features Editor of C2C Journal, talking about paid sick leave, who pays, how we should pay, whether we should pay, all of these topics. Peter, you were mentioning kind of how this is being, as a political football perhaps, being used to take sort of unfair advantage of the situation. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but is this become a political football with public sector or private sector unions? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I don't think there's any question that we can call the political left and unions, and certainly some academics, have always thought that paid sick days are a good idea, that it's a way of boosting worker compensation. These folks like the sort of more liberal European style labor market policies, and so this has become an opportunity to kind of push a favored policy. That's why they're asking for employer-paid permanent. This will be around long after the pandemic is gone, and that is a fairly substantial change to the labor market. I don't think it's the kind of thing you want to do in a panic. I think if this is on the table, then it needs to be debated in a kind of reasonable and rational way, and we need to take our time with that decision. It's a fairly, a large-scale change to the labor market. I don't think we want to rush into it.
Do you? What sort of other things are on the agenda? You said this is part of a plan by advocates to reform our labor codes, make them more European. What other items are on the menu there?
Well, certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw calls for universal basic income, which is another even larger change. So there's quite a few of these sorts of hobby horses, I guess, lying around, and this has become an opportunity to push them forward. And I think we got to be aware that the pandemic is a temporary crisis, hopefully shorter rather than longer, and we should be dealing with it with temporary measures wherever possible, because we want to get back to normal as quickly as possible. And we saw the universal basic income debate seems to have fallen off quite significantly.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Is there a reason for that, do you think? Maybe some of the warts in that idea have become more manifest over time? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we saw a couple of fairly credible reports that put the price tag in the hundreds of billions of dollars a year, and even though money seems to be flowing like out of an uncontrollable garden hose right now, I think calmer minds recognize that you can't possibly pay for that and all the other things that are going on. It's just price tag was just too large, as attractive as the idea may be as a pure concept.
Are there things we're learning from the pandemic, though, that are good ideas that are coming out of it?
It's a good question. I'd have to. Maybe that's a subject for my next story.
The next story.
I'm afraid I don't have anything in my back pocket for that. If you wanted to throw something my way, I could consider it. But
there's always more debate.
Certainly, we've seen that government can innovate a lot quicker than we ever thought, and that's probably a good thing. It would take months, if not years, to come up with a new government policy. And we've seen the federal government, to their credit, roll some things out pretty darn quickly. The CERB, for instance, and this Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit that we're talking about. And they're presented as temporary measures. No one is saying these are all carved in stone, and they've changed quite a bit as time has gone on. And I think that's to government's credit that they've been prepared to call audibles and run with what works and drop what doesn't.
Some people are saying that this is going to be ushering in a new era of greater government decision making in our lives. Do you see that as well?
Well, it's certainly, if we're going to pay for all this stuff, there's going to be a lot more government. The hand of government is going to be more ever present. That's for sure. There's all this talk of the Great Reset, and to what extent is life never going to go back to normal? And I think that's a real shame. We don't want, the same way we don't want the pandemic to be an excuse for bringing in a permanent paid sick day program when we haven't really thought it through. Sure. We don't want to do the same thing with a bunch of other policies either.
And we're back here at Boom and Bust. Thanks for rejoining us. We're here with Peter Shawn Taylor. He is the senior features editor of C2C Journal, talking about paid sick days. Peter, you've done an analysis for your article of how this actually works in practice, if I can put it that way, and you've got a couple of good anecdotes of what happens when you do have these use it or lose it items in paid sick days. So maybe go through that for our audience. I think that's a good case study.
Sure. If you create a permanent paid sick day program, what does that do? What are the impacts on employers? And there's fairly convincing evidence that the more paid sick days you create, the more paid sick days get taken. Employees tend to take all the paid sick days they have. Whether that means they're treating them as extra vacation days, or they're simply sick. There were times that they were sick and they went to work and now they don't. You can't really tease that out. But there are some anecdotes, as you say. One is in 2012, the Ontario teachers moved from a bankable sick day program in which if you didn't use your sick days one year, they got banked, and when you retired, you could get a payout of the entire amount that ran into tens of thousands of dollars. They got rid of that system because they thought it was open to abuse, and they moved to a use it or lose it system, whereas you had a certain number of sick days, and if you didn't take them at the end of the year, they disappeared. And what the Auditor General found out in a report, within 5 years, the amount of sick days taken was up 30%. So clearly there's incentive effects here, where Ontario teachers simply 30% sicker 5 years after the system was changed. It seems kind of suspicious to me. Other anecdotes, when Ontario had a paid personal leave day, not a sick day, but you could take it for any reason. It turned out the day after the Super Bowl was a phenomenally popular day to take the leave, and that put employers at a real disadvantage. Their employees just didn't show up the day after Super Bowl. And this is confirmed by all sorts of international academic research that employees tend to see paid sick days as a right rather than a privilege. And so, that's what employers are worried about, is it'll all get taken, and not necessarily for reasons of sickness.
Speaking of employers, there have been intimations from them that they support more paid sick days. Tell us a little bit about that story.
Well, yeah, I think the business community, and I'm talking here Ontario Chamber of Commerce and Canadian Federation of Independent Business, those sorts of organizations, they're very cognizant that if they came out and said, we're against paid sick days, they'd be seen as uncaring or anti-worker. So they're walking a very fine line here. They know that a permanent employer paid sick day program would be a serious burden on their members, could really crush a recovery. So they're not supporting that. But on the other hand, they want to seem like they're playing along with the concerns of workers. So they've been kind of vague, especially the Ontario Chamber of Commerce has been quite vague about saying that they support paid sick days, but what exactly do they mean by that is not always made clear. And so as a result, we've seen some commentators claim, the Chamber of Commerce is on board with a permanent system, and that's not really the case, and that leads to a lot of confusion, I think, and it's hard to have a good debate when both sides aren't really clear on what it is they mean by common terms. So that's a problem, I think, going forward.
How do you see this? We've got about 30 seconds left, but how do you see this playing out over the next few months?
I think the risks of a permanent program are simply too great, and that the provinces and the business community understands that. And I think the temporary program that we have, maybe it'll be extended, maybe it'll be enhanced in some ways, but I think the risks are too great to the recovery to really make the big sort of change that the paid sick day advocates claim they want.
Peter Shawn Taylor, thank you again for joining us yet again on our program. It was great to have your insights.
It's always a pleasure to be here.
For sure. Let me thank my guest again, Peter Shawn Taylor of C2C Journal, talking about paid sick leave, who pays, whether it's government or business, and what the impacts of that are on the economy. Obviously, no one wants to be against sick leave for employees, but it's obviously a little bit more complicated than that, as these things usually are. So thanks for joining us once again.